All right, we're recording. So I'm here to introduce tonight Dr. Rory Means from the Department of Animal Science, and he's going to do a talk tonight on meat cut identification. And we encourage you to ask questions if you're joining late. All right, Rory, go ahead.
Okay, I want to talk tonight about meat cut identification and some of the principles that are involved in that. First, I want to review a few of the resources, the most important resources that I think are available for fabricating meat or cutting meat or identifying meat. The first one on the list is Institutional Meat Purchase Specifications, and you hear this abbreviated as IMPS, IMPS, which obviously stands for Institutional Meat Purchase Specifications. This is online, available online from the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service, AMS, and I've got the call numbers there for that. And sometimes, if you join a collegiate meat judging team, it's even shortened more, and they call it specs. And specs are meat cuts that the meat judging team would identify and determine if there are any miscuts on those specs. And that's a pretty challenging thing that has to happen in collegiate meat judging, but it's kind of fun too to identify those cuts that way. The second is the Meat Buyer's Guide, and I'll just show you that here. And that's a very good guide to meat cuts. It doesn't so much explain exactly how to fabricate it, but it does tell where the cuts come from and where the cuts are derived, and some different ways to cut some of the meat products that you're going to see. And that's published by the Meat Institute and the National Association of Meat Processors, and it's a very, very good guide. Most of the material that we're going to be going through tonight is from that resource. And then finally, The Meat We Eat, that's this book. And this is a pretty old book. It's 14th edition, but it hasn't been updated for a while. But it has some chapters in it on beef, pork, and lamb fabrication. And that book actually tells you how to make the cuts. So if you're interested in this, you probably need to look at maybe these three resources. I want to go over now some factors that are necessary for determining or factors. Why do we cut meat? What are the factors involved in determining why we cut meat? So the first one is, I think, to separate the tender portions of the carcass from the less tender portions. And basically this is done by separating muscles or parts of the carcass. Today we separate more individual muscles than we've done in the past, but separate parts of the carcass based on their connective tissue content. And connective tissue is proteins that are tough. And they're tough because they give the animal strength. And if you can think about an animal, the cuts that are in the center of the carcass, we call those the middle meats along the back. Those are the more tender cuts, and those are generally where we get our steaks and chops. And then as we go to the extremities, the neck and the legs of the animal, those cuts have a lot more connective tissue, and they're quite a bit tougher. And we would cook those cuts differently. To degrade the connective tissue, you would cook with moist heat for a long period of time. And another reason or factor determining how we fabricate carcasses is to separate the lean portions from the less lean portions. So sometimes the fatty portions, we might cook those differently, or we might, in the case of beef, the fatty and the tougher portions we would grind into ground beef. And in fact, in the United States, over 50% of the beef that's consumed is actually ground beef. Then another reason is that we separate the thicker or the more heavily muscled portions from the thin muscled portions. And this is to give us a more consistent size for improved cookery. If you can think about two cuts, maybe a beef top round, which is a cut that's about 3, 4, 5 inches thick and about 8 to 12 inches in diameter, a very big muscle. If you were cooking that muscle, you would have to cook it much differently than the one I want to compare it to is a beef flank steak. which is only at most a ½ inch thick. So those are two different muscles that we separate based on their size. There's also some variability in tenderness in those two muscles. And then finally, today we're doing a lot of muscle separation, and we're trying to separate muscles and get an independent muscle out, because some are actually pretty tender that we used to bundle in with muscles that are less tender. And when we separate them out, then we can actually, that allows us to cut across the grain of the muscle and get a more uniformly cut with the grain or across the grain, so that we have a nicer product when we present that to the consumer. Maybe I'll talk about a couple of those examples as we go along. Now, the major cuts when we're talking about beef, pork, or lamb, which we're going to be talking about today, can be categorized as primals, subprimals, and retail cuts. Primals are the first cut. They're large subdivisions of the carcass. They're standardized system of cutting. We cut in the same place every time, so that we get, if you buy a primal, for instance, a beef rib, you know where it's cut and how it's cut. Or if you buy a beef loin, you know how it's cut. Then we cut those primals into smaller cuts. The next cut made is usually considered a subprimal. These are also standardized, and you could get, for instance, one of the popular ones is a beef short loin, which is where the T-bones and the tenderloin steaks would come from, would be separated from the sirloin, and the sirloin is towards the round or posterior part of the carcass. And these are usually the second round of cuts that are made. And then we'll take those, the primals and subprimals, and even cut them further down into the steaks and roasts and chops. And these would be what we call the retail cuts. The retail cuts are what you would see typically in a retail store. So those retail cuts are what you see in the meat counter. For instance, a beef T-bone steak or a lamb rib chop. Those are the cuts that you'd see that would be considered retail cuts. I want to mention a little bit about institutional meat purchase specifications, or IMPS. And I don't expect you to memorize the numbers, and we're going to be going through some numbers and using this system to identify some of our meat cuts. But I do expect you to know some of these basic things that we're going to go through on this slide. For instance, any number that starts with a 100 series, whether it's 101 or 189, if it's a 100, that's beef. So if you're taking notes, I would write that down, 100 beef. For instance, 101 is a beef side, whereas 100 is a beef carcass, and 102 is a beef forequarter. So what you need to note is that as the numbers get larger, the cuts get smaller, or more trimming or more work is being done to the cut to make the next cut. So if you have a cut 155, which is a beef hindquarter, it's derived from cut 101, which is the beef side, which is derived from cut 100, which is the beef carcass. And that's the same for every series that we're going to talk about. Then the 200 series is lamb. And an example here is that 230 is a lamb hind saddle. So any cut that isn't in the 200s is a lamb cut. Any cut in the 100s is a beef cut. We're not going to talk about veal, but veal would be the 300 series. We are going to talk about pork, and pork is a 400 series. So the pork carcass is 400. Now, if we add a 1 in front of those hundreds, another's the 1,000 place, and we have 1,000 series, the 1,000 series represent portion cuts. So for instance, that T-bone steak we talked about, that's a 1,000 series. So if there's 1,000, whatever the other numbers are, you know that it's a portion cut or a retail cut. More processing has been done to that cut. Now, I have here 1X, and if I can do this here, 1x here, or I'm pointing to, can you see that pointer, Garrett? Okay. So the x is like the hundredths place, okay? The 1 is a 1,000th place, and there's 2 places after that. So 1x, the x is the species. So if it's 1, 1, that's beef, a portion cut of beef. If it's 1, 4, that's a portion cut of pork. Right, Garrett? Okay, thank you. Now, if we go down to 1, 1, which would be portion cut beef, the XX is actually the primal, the subprimal portion, or could possibly be even more cutting till it's trimmed or some other thing about the cut. So we can go down here to a 1180. So that's a 1,180 is the way I like to think of it, 1,180, because a 180 I know is derived from IMPS number 180, which is the beef loin, strip loin, boneless. Okay, so the 1180 or the 1,180 is the beef loin, strip loin, steak, boneless, which is derived from the beef loin, strip loin, boneless. The whole loin then is cut into steaks, and so a 1,180 is derived from a 180, and a 180 is derived from a 175, a beef loin, strip loin, bone in, and a 175 is derived from a 174, beef loin, short loin. Okay, that's the subprimal. And then a 172, which is what the 174 is derived from, is the beef loin, full loin, and that's the primal. Now the full loin then can be broken into a subprimal, the short loin, and the sirloin, which isn't on this slide. So we can see that each one of these higher numbers is derived from a lower number. And this loin, the full loin, is derived then from the beef hindquarter, 155. So it can't be a number less than 155 because all the things from the hindquarter are higher numbers than that. Does that make sense? I hope so. Okay. So now let's move on. Again, I don't expect you to remember any numbers except 100 series is beef, 200 series is lamb, 400 series is pork, 1,000 series is portion, which whatever hundreds it is, beef, pork, or lamb, and that the higher numbers are derived from lower numbers. That's the basic principles we need to know. Now here are some anatomical terms that I may use during this presentation. I'm not going to quiz you over these, but these are good terms to know. Dorsal is toward the vertebral column, and you got to consider that the animal is standing its normal way, okay, standing up. So the vertebral column, or the top of the back, is dorsal, and opposite of that is ventral. And then cranial or anterior is towards the head, cranium is head, and caudal or posterior is towards the tail, the caudal vertebrae or the tail vertebrae. Then medial is towards the middle of the animal, and lateral is away from the middle of the animal. Proximal is close to a given part, like if you had your arm out, proximal would be the elbow is proximal to the hand because it's closer to the medial plane than the hand. And then distal is further away. So we may use some of those terms when we're talking about some of these meat cuts as they come up. Okay, so this slide I think is really important. And I'd like you to write down these 5 major factors that we use to identify meat cuts. So first is bones, and I think bones are the most important. If you can identify what bones are in the cut, that's going to tell you where the cut comes from, because we're going to look at the skeletal structure of beef, pork, and lamb carcasses. And then that's going to give us a really good clue as to what part of the carcass that comes from. Now, for boneless cuts, of course, the bones don't help us much. The next thing we're going to look at is muscles. and boneless cuts obviously have muscles. The muscles, luckily for us, are conserved, or they're the same essentially for each of the species. So happens, so are the bones. There's very little difference from the perspective of meat cut identification in the bones in a pig or a lamb or a beef, which is good, because if it looks like a blade bone in beef, lamb, or pork, then you know what part of the carcass that came from. Then the next three things are size, shape, and color. So the size, obviously, the beef are the largest, and that can help us identify a beef T-bone steak from a lamb, the new name for that, T-bone, or the older name and the 4-H name, the lamb loin chop. They look exactly the same except for the size. So you know that the small one is going to be from the lamb. The shape. Many of our cuts have a distinctive shape, and we'll talk about a few of those shapes as we go along. And finally, color. Beef and lamb are pretty similar in color. They're more of a bright cherry red or darker red color than pork. And pork is generally a lighter pinkish or gray color and has more variability of color between the different muscles in the cuts. And this is due to a pigment protein that we call myoglobin. And myoglobin is present in all muscles, but to different levels. The cuts that are the darker red have more myoglobin. And if you think about a chicken breast, it has even less myoglobin because it's not very red at all. It's white, in fact. Okay, so the primary bones that we need to learn are the vertebrae, the rib, the scapula, the humerus, the pelvic, and the femur. And it's not very many. There's a lot more bones than this in the carcass, but these are the ones that we need to learn to identify meat cuts. So I would write these down, vertebrae. And then know that there's three groupings of vertebrae, or separate names of vertebrae, and they're from different parts of the carcass. The thoracic vertebrae are all of the vertebrae that have a rib attached. Okay, and it's pretty important for us to know that for beef, usually we have 13 ribs, very rarely 14. For lamb, usually we have 13 ribs, but sometimes we have 14 ribs, more common in lamb. And for pigs, we have 14 or 15 ribs in pigs, okay? A little more variation, more rib. Then the lumbar vertebrae. The lumbar vertebrae are next, and those are the vertebrae that are behind the thoracic vertebrae, or more posterior in anatomical term. And the lumbar vertebrae are what we consider our lower back vertebrae. And then the last vertebrae that we probably need to know for meat cut identification are the sacral vertebrae. Usually if you see a meat cut with a sacral vertebrae, it's also going to have part of the pelvic or the hip bone in it, okay? Now, all of these vertebrae have different parts. They have a body of the vertebrae, which we call the chine bone, because sometimes our cuts have a chine bone that's removed or sawed off with a bandsaw that makes the cut a little more appealing because there's less bone, or makes if you're talking about a prime rib roast, if you cut the chine bones off, then you can actually cut between it with a knife. So if at the restaurant, the chef can cook the whole roast, but then can still cut portions of the roast. So it's important sometimes to remove the chine bone, and also what we call the feather bone. So we'll look at the feather bones here in a minute, but those, if you think about a vertebrae like this, and this is a spinal column, then we have some bone, part of the bone that sticks straight up. And especially if you think about a bull, for instance, that has a hump in its back, it has a real good dorsal process, we call that, the dorsal or the spinous process of the vertebrae. Then we also have, of those vertebrae, we have some of the a part of the vertebrae that sticks out like this. And this is called the transverse process. And if you think about a T-bone steak, that's what makes a T-bone steak. So we'll look at some of those. Then we also have ribs, and I have here the scientific name followed by the common name. So the vertebrae, then the common name would be the backbone. The rib, the common name is, this is a tough one, is the rib. The scapula, or the blade bone. The humerus, or we call that the arm bone. And the pelvic bone, or the hip bone. And then the femur, or the round bone. So if you see these bones, and we'll work on identifying those in a little bit, then you know that what part of the carcass that cut came from. So here's the bones again on the left side, and now on the right side is a beef skeletal chart. So if we think about, we'll just go down through here. We'll go through the vertebrae, the thoracic vertebrae. The thoracic vertebrae are any of these vertebrae that have a rib attached, okay? So there's 13 of those in the beef carcass. And the dorsal process are these here that are sticking straight up, or dorsally, or the spinous process. And another name for those we said was the feather bone. And then the body of the vertebrae here, if you consider that each carcass is split in half, then the body of the vertebrae would be the chine bone. The lumbar vertebrae, they follow the thoracic vertebrae and are in this region. Those are the lumbar vertebrae. Your T-bone and your porterhouse steaks would have the lumbar vertebrae. And then finally, the sacral vertebrae would be associated here with part of the hip bone. So if you see a cut through here that has a sacral vertebrae, it's also going to have part of the hip bone. In beef, you're not going to see that too often because we make these cuts boneless now. But you'll see the lumbar and the thoracic vertebrae in beef, pork, and lamb cuts. The ribs, of course, are here. These are the ribs. The scapula, or the blade bone, is right here. And this, I'm going to show you in the next slide that it's the same for every species. It looks almost the same. The humerus or the arm bone is this major bone, which is it articulates with the scapula. And that's the biggest bone in the front leg. And when you cut through that, it's a round shape. The pelvic or the hip bone then is in the hind quarter of the carcass, and this is that pelvic or hip bone. If you cut through all of these sirloin steaks bone in, which again you're not going to see today, you'll have different shapes of that pelvic bone. Then the femur or the round bone, that's the biggest bone in the back leg. And rarely do we see that in a beef carcass. We will see that in lamb, and we will see that in pork, but beef, it's just too big of a cut. So we have boneless round cuts. Here now, I want to talk about the similarities in the beef, pork, and lamb cuts. So take a look at this for a minute. So let's look at one thing here. Let's look at the arm bone, okay? So this is the arm bone in beef. This is the arm bone in lamb. This is the arm bone in pork. So if we see cuts that have that bone, and they may have some ribs in them too, we know that came from that part of the carcass. Obviously, the ribs are very similar in these carcasses, okay? So if you see a rib bone in a cut, you know what part of the carcass it came from. And then if we see these lumbar vertebrae, we know what part of the carcass that came from. the lower back portion of the carcass. Again, if you see a round bone, which I mentioned we won't see in beef these days, it's all boneless, but you will see that in pork leg center slices or lamb leg center slice, then you know that that's from the hind leg. So these bones can be very important in telling us where the cut is come from. If you see a rib and this big dorsal process or spinous process feather bone, then we know that that cut is from the rib in beef, or from the rib in lamb, or from the anterior portion of the loin in the pig. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the differences that we see when we fabricate the beef, the pork, and the lamb. In beef, the separation of the chuck and rib is between the 5th and 6th ribs here. Okay? A similar separation in pork, the shoulder and loin is between the 2nd and 3rd ribs. So now I want to go back and look at this, because this might not make sense to you. So this is the beef chuck. Let me get my laser pointer. This is the beef chuck, okay? We separate that between the 5th and 6th ribs. And then this is the rib portion, the chuck and the rib. But in pigs, we don't have a rib. This whole thing along the back here is called the loin. And we separate that from the shoulder, see this line here, between the 2nd and 3rd ribs. So that's another thing you should write down, that in beef, the chuck rib separation is between ribs 5 and 6. Whereas in pork, the shoulder loin separation is between ribs 2 and 3. And then if we go to lamb, we're going to change it even a little bit more. The shoulder rib rack separation, sometimes called the rib, sometimes called the rack, more commonly called the rack, is between the 4th and 5th ribs. So that's different from beef, because beef is the 5th and 6th ribs, and lamb is the 4th and 5th ribs, and pork is the 2nd and 3rd ribs. Another difference we see is that the rib loin separation, so if we go back here to look at this is the rib, and then this line here demarcates where the loin is separated from the rib, is between the 12th and 13th ribs. In the lamb, it's the same place, between the 12th and 13th ribs. In the so we got 12th, 13th lamb, we got 12th, 13th beef. In pork, there's no separation, okay? So, because the whole thing is a loin. If we go back and look, remember, this whole thing from here to here is the loin. Whereas in beef, the loin is only from here to here, and in lamb, it's only from here to here, okay? Now, in beef, I want to skip this loin round separation because that's pretty similar for beef and pigs. But I want to go the short loin, sirloin separation. We cut through the 6th lumbar vertebrae, and that separates a major subprimals, the loin into the short loin and the sirloin. Those are major subprimals. In lamb, and this is very important, the loin leg separation is anterior to the hip bone, okay? And that's important, and I want you to write this down, that in lamb, the sirloin chops are derived from the leg. Whereas in beef, the sirloin cuts are derived from the loin. And then in pigs, let's go back here. The blade chops here, whoops, I better get my right pointer. The blade chops from the loin would have part of this blade bone in them. Then some rib chops would have ribs. Then we'd have some maybe top loin chops, and then some loin chops, and then sirloin chops would have this part of the pelvic bone. Those are all from the loin. Those are the major differences when we fabricate those carcasses. And because those are different, we have cuts that come from different places. It looks like the same cut. An example is a sirloin chop from a lamb is from the leg. It looks like a sirloin steak, bone in, which we don't see, but we see all the boneless sirloin steaks. But the sirloin steaks are from the loin. The sirloin lamb chop is from the leg. Now, let's go on and look at some muscles. Okay, so the primary muscles that we need to know are in this list. I've made it a little bit easier, and the ones that are black, you have to know. That's what you're going to be tested over. The ones that are gray are nice to know, but you can identify the cut without knowing the muscle. If we know the longissimus dorsi muscle and where it is in the carcass, then we can identify, who's that to help us identify a lot of different cuts. So let's go back. The longissimus dorsi runs along the back on either side of the backbone, dorsal. The reason it's called longissimus is because it inserts back here in the hip and runs all the way up between the shoulder blades and inserts in the front shoulder. It's longissimus, it's the longest muscle in the carcass. Dorsi, because it's dorsal, it's the top or the top of the back of the animal. So that's a longissimus dorsi. If it's in a rib primal, like the beef rib, then we call that the rib eye. That's the common name. If it's in the loin, we call it the loin eye. So in any pork chop that has a longissimus muscle, you're going to call it the loin eye because there is no rib. There's no rib primal in pork. Now, let's skip down to number 3, and that's the infraspinatus, or the top blade, or the flat iron. So let's go back here, and it's going to be right here, right where my pointer is. And you can see the spinous process here of the shoulder blade. That top blade muscle is right below that. And you can take that muscle off, pretty easy actually, but the muscle is going to be kind of like your hands put together with a very heavy seam of connective tissue in the middle. So what we often do is seam that connective tissue out, then you have these two pieces without the connective tissue, and those two pieces are what we call the flat iron steak, but it's from this muscle right here. Now, the next muscle we're going to look at is the deep pectoral muscle, or the brisket muscle. And that is a muscle that is right down here, laying above the ribs, and that's the brisket primal. And that's a muscle that we'll see in beef. It's in every species, but we actually make a cut out of it in beef. Of course, we call that the brisket. The semimembranosus. So I'm going to go 3 at a time here. The semimembranosus is the top round muscle. And that you should write down, the semimembranosus is the top round, is also called the inside round. It's on the inside of the leg, okay? It's more tender on the inside of the leg. It's very strong muscle, very big muscle. It's more tender. 8, the biceps femoris. That's the bottom round muscle. It's less tender. It's on the outside of the leg. So sometimes we call the biceps femoris or the outside round, bottom round or outside round. And then the third muscle is a semitendinosus. And this is the eye of round. And you can see this in animals. If you look at an animal, at the rear end of an animal, standing behind it, this is a muscle that looks kind of round on the outside back portion of the leg. Those 3 muscles are the muscles of the hind leg, the primary muscles of the hind leg. The top or the inside is the semimembranosus, the bigger muscle probably that you'll see. The biceps femoris or the bottom round is the inside or the outside muscle. The semitendinosus or the eye of round is another outside muscle. And this muscle happens to be relatively high in elastin. Elastin is a type of connective tissue that won't degrade when you cook it. So no matter how long you cook this, it's going to still be pretty tough. And that's important with this muscle because it's a round muscle that sometimes can be confused with the tenderloin muscle, except it has a lot coarser texture than the tenderloin muscle. Now, another major muscle, number 10, is the psoas major. The psoas major is the primary muscle of the tenderloin. Now, this muscle lies inside the body cavity. So it's going to be inside here it starts about the 13th rib and then gets gradually larger as it gets back into the pelvic region. And this muscle as it gets larger, then we call those porterhouse steaks. It's inside the body cavity. It doesn't have to have a lot of connective tissue. So it is a very tender muscle, one of the most tender muscles in the carcass. That's why, of course, we call it the tenderloin. There's another muscle that we're going to talk about when we talk about tenderloin versus porterhouse steaks, and that's the gluteus medius muscle or the jump muscle. And that muscle, it doesn't start in the back until we get back up in this region. And then that muscle starts and gets larger and larger as we go back. And that's why it's called the jump muscle, because you really see that muscle work when an animal jumps, for instance, over a little ditch or a small fence or something. Now, the last one is the rectus abdominis. That's the flank muscle. And these muscles are named for their location, they're named for their function, they're named for where they insert or where you find them attached to the bone, and that's how most muscles are named. So now, let's take a look at the similarities between the beef, pork, and lamb muscles, okay? They're the same. So it doesn't matter if we're talking about beef, it doesn't matter if we're talking about pork, it doesn't matter if we're talking about lamb, they all have the same muscles. That's good for us. So when we identify cuts, we only have to know one set of muscles, one set of bones, and that's going to help us identify those cuts. Now, beef muscles. This is the same list of muscles. And we have the long isthmus dorsi, or it could be called the rib eye or the loin eye muscle. We're going to talk about number 3, this infraspinatus or the top blade. And if we remove the connective tissue, we call that the flat iron. And the deep pectoral muscle or the brisket muscle. Then number 6, the semimembranosus or the top round muscle. And number 8, the biceps femoris or the bottom round muscle. Remember that semimembranosus, the top round muscle, is also called the inside round. And this is the outside round, as well as the semitendinosus is the outside round we talked about. We have the psoas major, the tenderloin, which lies inside the body cavity and is more tender. It's much less connective tissue. The gluteus medius, or the jump muscle, and the rectus abdominis, or the flank muscle. So what I want you to do now is to take a minute and see if you can identify which cuts on the right-hand side here might have the longissimus dorsi muscle in them.
We have your handout from this weekend, so lucky us.
Well, that's good. Yeah, that's really good. You see any? Tell me one.
Maybe the strip loin steak.
Exactly. The strip loin. What's the number on that?
1,180.
Okay, so you're looking at a steak.
Yes.
Okay. So we know it's a steak. I knew it was a steak immediately because it had a 1,000. So that's a portion cut. So 1,180. Yep, exactly. Now, do you see a 180, another 180 muscle there? Or 180, yeah, 180. Right below there, do you see that?
Oh yeah, yeah.
So that's where the 1,180 came from the 180. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Yep. And then what about a 109? Does that look like it has a longissimus muscle? Above there, two above there? It's above the 1180. Yeah. So that's from the rib. Okay. And we know it's further forward because it's a smaller number. And then a 109D has even got some more trimming done to it. Okay. And then we have the 1,112 to the right of that, which came from the 112A to the right of that. And you can kind of see how this animal is coming apart. Can you kind of see that?
Yeah.
So these numbers kind of make sense. After you study these a little bit, they kind of make sense, and you can see where a 1,112 or 1112 comes from. It comes from a 112. You know where that comes from. Okay, I want to go down here and jump to this psoas major muscle. Can you see any cuts that might have that psoas major or the tenderloin muscle in them?
Maybe the tenderloin steak.
Absolutely.
1190.
Yep, certainly. And the 1190, it says there, side muscle off. And we didn't talk about that, but let's look back up at the screen for a minute. And so we're talking about the psoas major tenderloin muscle. So it has that muscle, but the side muscle, this side muscle is off. And that's called the psoas minor. So the psoas major is the tenderloin muscle that's bigger. The psoas minor is a tenderloin muscle that's smaller. Okay. And then if you look at 189B, which is here, well, that also is a tenderloin. Okay. Now, if we think about, if we go way back to this slide with the skeletal structure, and we think about cutting through this loin this way, okay, so we're going to cut through the longissimus muscle. We're going to cut through the tenderloin. So if we go back and we look at that steak, that's this steak. Okay. Now this is the longissimus muscle. And the longissimus muscle, if we, let me get a little different pointer here. This and this are the same muscle. And this are the same muscle. Okay. And this and this and this and this They're all the long isthmus muscle. So if we get an idea in our head what the long isthmus muscle looks like, we're going to be able to identify all those cuts and where they come from. And we know that this cut up here, better get my pointer, up here has rib bones in it. So we know it came from where the ribs are, the beef rib. And then this doesn't have any rib bones, and even here, and so it came from the loin. So look here, that's tenderloin, that's tenderloin, that's tenderloin, that's tenderloin, that's tenderloin steaks or medallions. Very good. So now let's go to the next slide, and I've done this for you a little bit. I've identified the IMPS numbers that are on the right-hand side that have the long isthmus dorsi in them, or that have the top blade in them up here, or that have the deep pectoral muscle or the brisket up here, or the semimembranosus, the top round right here, or the biceps femoris or the bottom round, or the psoas major tenderloin, or the gluteus medius jump muscle, the porterhouse only. So this is 173, but only this one has the jump muscle. So now I'm going to draw that in here. That muscle right there is the porterhouse muscle. Okay. Is the jump muscle. And that will tell you, if you have a jump muscle, you have a porterhouse steak. And some identification schemes would use the size of this tenderloin muscle and use that to determine if it's a porterhouse steak. I'm going to tell you that in most retail stores, they're not going to call it a porterhouse unless it has that jump muscle or that gluteus medius muscle in it. Now, one more muscle we're going to look at, the rectus abdominis, right here, the flank steak. So, you probably don't need to know the scientific name of too many muscles. I would say, let's learn the long isthmus dorsi. Let's learn the psoas major. And then the rest, probably we can get by with just knowing the name of the cut. But knowing where those muscles are is really important to help us identify, just as important as the bones, I think. So let's take a look at lamb. The long isthmus dorsi, the semimembranosus, the biceps femoris, the psoas major. Where are those cuts? Let's take a minute and look over here and see if you can identify where those cuts are. You're lucky you have Robin there to help you with all this.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, there's lamb.
You can dig out pork next if you want, Robin.
Okay.
Can you find cuts with the long isthmus muscle?
Maybe the lamb rib chops.
Yep. These rib chops, they're Frenched. Frenched means that we're taking the soft tissue off the rib bone and leaving that exposed. So those would have it, these would have it, these would have it, these would have it. Yep. Any other lamb cuts that would have a long isthmus dorsi?
Lamb short loin.
Yep. Absolutely. And then the lamb loin, 232. Now, here's something we haven't talked about in terms of the IMPS numbers. If you see a 232, and then you see a 232A, Means you did a little something different to it. You trimmed the fat off maybe. And then you see a 232C, you've done even more. What's the difference between the C and the A, the 232C and the 232A?
I'm not sure.
Read 232C.
Oh, well, oh, they took it's bone.
Exactly. Boneless.
Yeah.
Okay. So a C is derived from an A. It's trimmed more. More is done to it. Okay. Same as if a higher number, you do more to it. More higher letter, you do more to it. Okay. Now let's look at a 1,232A. You see that one?
Yep.
What do we have there?
Lamb loin chops with bones.
Yep. So it's 1,232A. If you had a 1,232C, that would be boneless loin chops. And if you take the bone out, you can't leave the tenderloin on because the bone is what holds, the bone holds on. Both muscles are attached to the bone. So if it's a 232C, it's not going to have tenderloin. Very good. Okay. And then a 232D. Do you see that one?
Yeah.
What is that?
It's a short tenderloin.
Okay. What's the scientific name of that muscle?
Let's see. I can't.
Yep, psoas major.
Yeah, so
Exactly. Very good. Are you going to study meat science when you come to the University of Wyoming? You should, I
not
think.
honestly, but
Huh?
maybe not. I don't think so.
Well, you should at least be on the meats team because you got a natural ability here. So I switched to the next slide, and we've got some numbers in here that tell you where we're going to see those muscles on this page, similar to the last one. Okay? Now, let's go on to guess what species next? You're right, pork. Okay? In pork, I want to look at the longissimus dorsi, the semimembranosus, the biceps femoris, and the psoas major. So take a minute to look at those pork cuts and see which ones you can find those muscles in. Find some?
Yeah.
Okay, what about number one, the longissimus dorsi?
So 410.
Okay, yep.
413. 412 maybe.
Did you say 414?
Yeah.
Yep,
412G,
yep,
and then 1413,
yep.
and then 412,
412?
413 too.
Yep.
And
What about these things here?
yeah, those ones too.
Yep, because they all come from these, right?
Mm-hmm.
So remember, the interesting thing about the pork loin is it's everything. It's the rib and the loin, okay? So we have all these ribs in it, and it's still called the loin. So what will we call that? Will we call that the loin eye or the rib eye? Up here.
The 412.
I mean, what would we call it? The loin eye, the common name, or the rib eye for the longismus muscle?
Wouldn't it be?
It would be the loin eye, right? Because it's from the loin primal in the pig, right? Whereas if we had all these ribs in here in beef, we'd call it the rib eye because that's from the rib primal. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Okay. What about the psoas major here? Can you find some cuts with that muscle?
415. Maybe. Yeah, 415.
Yep. That is the tenderloin. Do you see a chop that has a tenderloin in it?
Maybe 1495. No. Maybe.
How about 1410?
Yep.
Okay. But not all of them. This one and this one, right?
Yeah.
Yep. Good. You've got it. Okay. Now, we're going to have these leg muscles, the semimembranosus, the biceps femoris, in the legs. Okay. This muscle that's exposed right here actually is the semimembranosus muscle. So the leg, the pork leg, this is boneless, but it's still going to have those leg muscles in it. And this one is semi-boneless, but it has those big leg muscles in it. Very good. Now I want to back up a minute. I want to see, can we see any of these cuts that might have a blade bone in it? It's kind of hard to see, but I think you can see a couple.
Maybe 1406.
Yep, exactly. So where do those come from?
The shoulder.
Yep, if it's got a blade bone, it either has to come from the shoulder or the very front part of the loin. Okay? And then if you look up here at this blade Boston, it's got a blade bone in it too. That's a little harder to see, I think. So that's good. And here they handily have the skeletal structure of the pig so that we can take a look at that and compare it to these. Very good. Okay. So now we've gone through these muscles, and I have this slide that has these cuts on here that shows you which cuts have those muscles in it, which you don't need because you got all those right. I want to know if you have any questions for me about how we cut meat or why we cut meat or where the muscles are or anything like that.
Gotta think of one. You're not off the hook till you have the question.
Ooh, she's kind of tough, isn't she, Karen?
Yeah. I'll say. I don't know.
Ask him how you make round steak edible.
Well, yeah, I guess how do you make round steak edible?
Well,
Obviously, my least favorite.
It's mine too.
so two ways to do that. One is to cut it really thin, and you could, if you cut it thin enough, then it's easier to chew through, of course, and then not cook it very, very much. And that can be in stir fry, where you could lightly cook it, or a number of other ways. But cut it thin. And you almost have to have the butcher do this and cut it thin, or you could maybe cut it into strips when it's partially frozen at home. The other way is to, and you can see which slide I'm on here, I went back to the beef muscles and the semimembranosus top round 169 right here, okay? is to cook it as a roast, because the connective tissue that's in that muscle is going to degrade as you cook it for a long time with moist heat. One of the major mistakes, and we'll be talking about this in some of our other meat pods, is that people make when cooking meat is they cook it up to the temperature and they think it's done. And it is done, except for it's not good. So you would cook this top round for maybe 6 hours, but not get it above a temperature of maybe 150. And it's going to be pretty tender and pretty juicy because you've degraded the connective tissue, cooked it for a long period of time, but not cooked so long that it's going to be dry. So either I would leave it as a roast and cook it as a roast, or if you wanted to even cook it in a crock pot, which gets it to a high temperature, but it would degrade the connective tissue and make it a more edible product. Round steak is not that good. You're right. And if you're going to cook it in a frying pan, don't cook it very long. That's the biggest problem. Or even on a grill. And then when you serve it, like you could grill this and get a nice flavor and cook it to maybe medium rare. And then before you serve it, put it on a cutting board and slice it into thin strips and put it on people's plates, 4 or 5 strips. That would be a decent way to serve it. But you're slicing it thin so that it can be chewed through. That's a very good question. I'm glad that you asked that question, Garrett. Do you have any other questions? I'm going to ask you a question if you don't. What's your favorite cut of meat?
Honestly, I'd have to say prime rib.
Okay. Where does that come from? We're on the right page.
There you go.
Give me the IMPS number.
Let's see. I don't know.
There's a hint in the name, prime rib.
Yeah, well, maybe 109.
Yeah, it depends. It could be a 109. It could be a 109D. It could even be a little higher number than that, a 112 if it's boneless. Okay?
Oh, okay.
So you're right on track. It's one of those from the rib. Yep, very good. A lot of them today are cooked boneless, but not all of them. So that's right. So what's the major muscle that you find in that prime rib?
Wouldn't it be the long?
It is the longissimus dorsi. Exactly. Is there going to be a tenderloin in there?
Yes, kind of. Yeah.
Give me the other answer.
No.
No. Because it's from the rib, it's too far forward. Remember, the tenderloin doesn't really start till about the last rib. Remember that?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Okay. Any other questions? Robin, you have any questions?
I do not. I actually have to tell you, Worry, I learned more. Of course, I was paying better attention this time, but I learned better this way than I did when in person.
Then you did what?
Than I did in person. Isn't that crazy?
You mean when we were in the meat lab?
Uh-huh. Maybe I just too cold.
Maybe because.
No, that maybe. I think, yeah. I think it would have been better if we could do this and then go to the meat lab, but
I do too.
Don't always get that
Yeah.
choice.
I think next year we'll make sure we do it the other way.
Yeah. And then, they could bring these, review this maybe before they go in there, and that would be.
Absolutely.
I kind of made this based on my lecture in the meat lab, and based on what resources I had. But, yeah. Good.
It's very good.
Yeah. Maybe I'm more organized with the PowerPoint.
No, you did a great job.
Okay, that's all the slides unless you have some questions. If you can get those basic principles, then you've kind of got this figured out. There's a few little things you need to just memorize when you see cuts, but the bones and the muscles, you'll have it.
Very good.
Okay,
All right. Thank you, Wari.
you're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Garrett. Enjoyed visiting with you.
And Dawn texted me and just told me that all of her kids are at the FFA banquet tonight. Sorry.
Oh, that would be okay. But
Bad
that's why we recorded it.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yep, good.